This is Growth Guide, a podcast exploring the depths of curiosity, questioning everything in the name of growth. I'm your host, Brian D'Alessandro. My guest today is Dr. Paul Canali. Dr. Canali has been involved in trauma and stress research for over 30 years. During that time, he has researched, developed, and practiced some of the most reproducible and effective forms of trauma therapy. Now let's clear up a couple of things when it comes to trauma. We often think trauma means the huge tragic events like experiencing a natural or man-made disaster or physical violence. And yes, these are forms of big T trauma, but there are also little t traumas that we all experience. These could be things like a breakup, the death of a pet, losing a job, getting bullied, or really anything that affects us. The reality is we've all experienced traumas that we've ended up holding on to until we were no longer even aware that they were affecting our lives. For anyone who seeks to live a life of freedom, connection, and love, this work is for you. Now, while trauma has recently become a key focus in psychology, neurology, and overall health and wellness, Dr. Paul has been studying the field for decades. In fact, long before there even was a field. He discovered that a thorough understanding of trauma biology and its autonomic nervous system responses carries with it a new knowledge and treatment of trauma and the origins of a vast amount of human disease and suffering. Activation and balancing of the same autonomic processes involved in healing trauma also provides new and improved treatment options and cures for a vast number of other diseases and diagnoses that have not previously been associated with traumatic exposure. Dr. Canali has originated and developed powerful new therapeutic approaches to healing trauma, anxiety, and chronic pain called Unified Therapy. I've had the fortune of experiencing unified therapy and the powerful effects of the work. One of the things about carrying old wounds or traumas is that they often become negative or fear-based thought patterns, and whether we're conscious or unconscious of them, they exist. Dr. Paul's method empowers his clients to transcend and release the story. Allowing the story to be the gateway to the body, they activate a sensation in the emotional or physical body that's stuck. And the client is coached on developing tools in order to follow those sensations and facilitating a somatic release. On the episode, Dr. Paul talks us through his approach, somatic healing, the ACE score, which was developed to measure likelihood of traumatic effects, how psychedelics can be complementary to the work, and he pays tribute to the other pioneers in the field, like Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, and Dan Siegel, to name a few. We're going to cover a lot of ground here, so get comfortable and let go. Hey, Dr. Paul, so glad to have you with us today. This is going to be a fun conversation. I know I've had the fortune of experiencing a few sessions of your work, and I'm really excited to talk about it today and introduce a lot of people to it.
Okay, glad to be here.
Let's see, where do we want to jump into this? I mean, I feel like today we're in a time where trauma is a big buzzword, and there's a lot of folks doing amazing work around trauma, from Gabor Mate to Dan Siegel, Thomas Hubble, and yourself. What I love about your approach is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems it's very much about focusing it on the level of feeling versus the mental story of it.
Yeah, so it started off, like you said, trauma, and then the word might have changed. The Center of Disease Control created an amazing research body around adverse childhood experiences. Because at first, it was so obvious a lot of times. The whole search or the awareness of that a powerful emotional event could have broad-ranging effects is, believe it or not, how psychotherapy was born. Because Freud was a medical doctor. He and some of his cohorts at that time, even the father of neurology at that time, were getting together, and they were witnessing strange things would happen to people, especially after, it had to be very obvious to them, a traumatic event. Somebody saw somebody get run over by a coach, and then they had paralysis, or they lost their eyesight, or they had strange pains or phantom pains, right? And as Freud went further, the great discovery was, and Bezel von de Kolff often talks about this, that the wealthy Viennese society that he was often involved with and talking with were abusing their children. And so that's a pretty heavy thing to realize. So he had to kind of mute the therapy and the understanding of it, that we as human beings were doing things to each other that could have broad ranging effects. The neurology person I was talking about, Charcot, he's the father of modern neurology. And these guys used to get together in Saint-Pétrier, it's in France, in Paris, and they would start looking at this strange world. How could strong emotional events cause such powerful physical things, right? And then they started looking further, and they saw that it seemed to be more prevalent with women, and they called it hysteria or hysterical conversion.
Hmm.
Well, women are different because of their hormones and their emotion, and they experience stressful events differently. So anyway, modern day, it gets buried for a long time. No one really understands it. Post-traumatic stress isn't even in the vocabulary. It wasn't in Vietnam. It wasn't even until supposedly, I think, in the 80s that they even dared even talk about that an individual could be in combat and no physical wounding, but they were left greatly changed by the experiences they had. And so now we're going deeper and deeper. And then there's certain individuals, like I said, when I started, there was very, very few individuals even using this language. And remember, I'm a chiropractor by trade. Yes, and I was over in Japan and I worked in hospitals. I got a couple of acupuncture degrees on the side. But my main discoveries were always in brain body awareness. So even in when we started sports medicine back in the 80s, believe it or not, there was no manual therapy. Physical therapists didn't use their hands in manual therapy. Chiropractors didn't use their hands for manual therapy techniques. And we worked with a school down here called Educating Hands to first get into doctor's office that, hey, there's a different thing that happens when you bring in a wider range of sensory and proprioceptive mechanisms than movement, stretch, Feldenkrais, Pilates, all those things. But eventually I came to the place, and I remember there's certain patients you have, and you realize no matter what you do physically, it's not going to change them. So I was like, there's got to be something else going on here. Why is this person constantly ill? Why do people have chronic pain? I started for the first time too to merge mental health techniques with physical application. And for the first time, we started to break some of these chronic pain patterns. Right? So the number one condition in all the medicine today is chronic pain, meaning you can have an MRI of somebody's spine and say, hey, Mr. Gonzalez, you have two bulging discs and herniations. You have stenosis. You shouldn't even be walking. Don't you have pain? No, I don't have any pain. And then we would see other MRIs of people with relatively normal but severe pain, right? And a pioneer in that area, because you're going to see, I'm going to bring many people in. And I believe it's so important to honor all those people that went before. And I look at it as a giant puzzle. I believe that's one of my skills, is the ability to see the pieces of the puzzle to put it together for the whole and not just glorify one method or technique, to see how are they working. John Sarno, let's talk about. Wonderful videos on him if you watch, but
And a documentary out there.
documentary. And I actually was involved with the filmmaker when he was doing the documentary. And I remember I was going to go to New York that day for the premiere, and he died the day before, Dr. Sarno, because I wanted to meet him personally.
Yeah, I got goosebumps on that, right? The fact that he died the day before,
That's right.
it's not a coincidence in my eyes,
There
right?
you go. And as you enter this inner world, you realize, wow, when there's sort of a higher part you could call a soul journey, something is complete. It's like, that's my mission. But, here's a man who had this idea that, wait, you can't just look at pain as a physical manifestation that you have to look at the whole person, right? And a lot of times he began to see the personality. He didn't understand necessarily about the trauma stuff, but he realized, wow, how a person's personality is and how they treat their body could have a direct outcome on pain.
He really drew a correlation of that psychosomatic
That's right,
dynamic,
right.
right? Just to step back, as you're talking about these different individuals through time who have really changed the way we've approached medicine, I think it's important to recognize what was the overarching approach at the time. When we talk about Freud, it was a very psychological aspect. We were, in a larger sense, still in that Newtonian way of looking at life where it was almost mechanical and the body was mechanical and we were trying to isolate parts and break it down, with the mind and the conscious and subconscious being the thing that was spoken about. That became this big theme. But then psychosomatic became a connection where we realized, wow, the way someone is thinking can affect how they're feeling and what a disease might be. Dr. Sarno's work was incredible in that. And then I think you mentioned Van der Kolk, who The Body Keeps the Score, and there's other great works like The Mind Body is another one by was it Ditchfield, that speak about how, oh wow, there's a separate experience within the body that can sometimes be separate from the mind itself. Your work seems to go deep into this, and the trauma work that's unfolding seems to as well. In our modern realm, what are you seeing, and what is that opportunity that's really blossoming?
Yeah, so then it's even way beyond the trauma because it's obvious, because a lot of times you see people that have had major traumatic events. So when somebody comes to the office, as you know, there's an extensive trauma history, but not everybody can access that. And a lot of people will tell you, I have no memory past the age of 15 or 5 or 10. And that's part of this defense mechanism we have. And those things you don't want to actually bring up until you have resources, but they come up anyway. And a lot of people will tell you trauma, the negative effects, which is called a implicit or procedural memory. So that's the body's memory to a T of the event, but you don't know where it's coming from. You wake up with incredible anxiety or depression, or you feel this deep sense of hopelessness and despair, and you have no idea that you have been triggered or something has triggered you. Let me give you a simple example. You are at a concert and it's over and you had a wonderful time, and there's some food trucks out there, and there's a particular food truck that you have wanted to try. You've heard about the food. You get online and you're starving, you're waiting. Finally, it's your time. You place your order. Unbeknownst to you is a man standing next to you. And that man is covered in Old Spice cologne. Average person would mean nothing, right? But to you, that's the same cologne that your uncle wore when he used to come into your room at night uninvited. You don't remember, your brain doesn't even remember, but now you go to eat your food and you lose your appetite. You think something's wrong with the food. You think you're getting a bug. That's how complicated those mechanisms are. The body remembers, but the mind doesn't. The ultimate journey is this: we got to change the model, because most people think, oh, things are so terrible. It's the basic law of thermodynamics, is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed.
Hmm.
All those things that have you walled off and hid are essentially potential energy ready to be moved into kinetic energy, movement, and thermodynamics for growth and development. All the neural pathways feed on that, right? And whether we're in a simulation or what it is, that's the way they set it up. It's like an evolutionary weeding ground too. It's like, if you do these things and you move forward and you become more conscious, we will gift you, right? And as you had mentioned, Dan Siegel, right? So Dan Siegel is a neuroscientist, but he was originally very big into a field called attachment psychology. Mary Ainsworth. And years ago, they had a prediction just by filling out a form, the Dole Attachment Questionnaire. They could kind of predict like where your life was at, or how it was going, or how your relations were going. And it's like, well, how is that possible? Because again, we went back to early childhood experiences. Center for Disease Control, in one of the largest studies they've ever done, by far the most controversial. It's called the ACE study. Thousands of individuals. They did it also in conjunction with Kaiser Permanente, which is the largest HMO in California.
ACEs, adverse child experience.
Adverse childhood experience. Remember, we're not saying it's trauma, because a lot of people say, I didn't have any trauma. It's like, dude, it's not what you think, right? That early attachment. So there's questions in there. Did you ever feel special? Do you ever feel not wanted? Do you ever feel like nobody ever connected to you, right? There's that, oh, well, my parents were always too busy, or, we always had enough food. We always had enough. But did they ever hug you? Did they ever connect you? Did they ever seem interested in you? So these are critical things that, if not received, your essential system goes into hibernation, and it's waiting. It's like what's that story? Is it Snow White, where she's in hibernation and then the prince has to come along?
Sleeping Beauty, right?
Sleeping Beauty. There you go. Yeah. Sleeping Beauty. It has to be a certain stimulus, and the same. There has to be a certain stimulus, right? And now we're understanding the nervous system is way different when we thought. People, like, if you ever watch Michael Levine talking about bioelectricity, and it's like, wait, learning isn't down at the DNA so much. It's that these bioelectrical currents are happening at unbelievably fast rates,
That really ties into the modern understanding we have around how the nervous system develops, how the vagal nerve, which I haven't heard spoken about much of before, 5, even 7 years ago. Now it's this big thing. And also how the neurology is wired. And so in our early years, as you're talking about, this is setting us up where we get wired for certain defense mechanisms or just relationship to the world based on the experiences we've had. And as Gabor Mate says, right, a trauma is not the event that happened, it's how we perceived the event, which is where also it comes into the individual and what your experience of the event was.
Yes, or like you said, this thing. So here's another thing. When I speak, I said this is absolutely a possibility for a turning point in the entire history of the human experience, because up to this point, our main focus is externally based. It's much more cognitive stuff, intellectual, soothing through cognition. This is a different world now, right? This is the world. The inner world is vast. You can build, you have to experience emotional fitness, just like, physical fitness, right? So you have an individual that is incapable, say they really want to do this 10K, their office is going to do it, and they've been invited to participate, but they try and they can barely make it around the block. Is it not possible, though, with the right training and the right support for them to do that and actually run that race? And when they do it, the elation that they get, the feeling they get, is unlike anything they ever experienced, right? That's a change in energy. The inner world, the emotional world, is very much like that, but even magnified in many, many different ways. So, turning point, because it's like we have spent so much time in cognition, entertainment, distraction. The world today is a massive distraction, massive amount of distraction, and not developing critical brain structures. Because on the beginning, he's talked about Siegel, and Siegel was one of the ones that identified 9 structures of development in your middle prefrontal cortex. So, what is that? That's this part of the brain that sits above the fear center, the anxiety center, the limbic system, the amygdala, and basically what we say is your ticket out of hell. But remember, all these people you said are theorists. God love them. I remember sitting with Bezel. We were at a trauma seminar for veterans. So everybody showed up, and I was eating lunch with Bezel, and I had an invite from a person that had worked with him, and we were sitting and we're talking. And he says, Paul, I've written a lot of books. And I said, I know. And he said, but I don't have a trauma method. He messes around a little with EMDR and stuff. And he says to me, Paul, when are you going to write a book? And I looked at him. I said, I don't know. I'll get around to it. But I haven't written many books, but I do have a trauma method, a unified method that invites everybody's methodology into a new way of looking at things. And it's not just for trauma. It's the end of chronic pain. It's the end of anxiety. And it's the new methodology for self-exploration. So back to, we have to even look like, how did this whole thing come about that they found that there's a super brain? And you know how it came? It came because the Mind Science group used to get together, usually in Washington, D.C., the Dalai Lama, and a lot of scientists that were interested in meditation. That basically, let's say they were mostly Buddhists, but that's not popular in the scientific world, you know. But they wanted to prove that there was benefits. They knew there was benefits in their own life. They had seen benefits, but it was Richie Davidson who got a bunch of equipment together, asked the Dalai Lama if he could study the Buddhist brains. There was complications. At first, they didn't want to do it. But the big deal was that when they studied the Buddhist brain, something revolutionary in the whole history of science and neuroscientists have, they realized that these Buddhist monks' brains were different than a normal person. That was unheard of. Physiologically, and guess what area was different? The middle prefrontal cortex.
Which is responsible for
affect regulation, emotional regulation, fear extinction, intuition, morality, compassion, all the mystical stuff, even compassion, intuition, body awareness. Think about that. So you can pick up on a disease before it becomes a real problem. You see, disease is rampant. You know, one of the most common surgeries today for an orthopedic is hip replacement, hips, knees. That's supposed to be impossible if your brain and your hip and your knee is connected. Impossible. You see, there's a physiological disconnect. Usually, early experiences take of this vessel. You know how many years, decades have been waiting for people to even be interested in this world of inner exploration? So huge exploration in medicinals, plant medicines, and non-plant medicines, you know. There was guys way before the plant people, like Dr. Lilly, right down here in Coconut Grove. This guy had tanks studying dolphins, right? One day, Dr. Lilly decides, well, I'm done with the dolphins. I'm going to put myself in there, get it sensory deprivation, so get the temperature at body temperature, block my eyes, block my ears. Oh, and maybe I'll take a huge hit of LSD on top of it. So in his book, was one of the first psychonauts. They got lost because then they started to use too much stuff. They started to go into ketamine and eventually lost his mind, which is what will happen if you continue on that path. But was one of the first, you know the Ram Dass story, all those types of people started this inner journey. But eventually, like Ram Dass, came to realize, oh my God, I have to move away from that early intervention to tie into something greater. And Ram Dass, which I knew personally, and Krishna Das and all these people talk about the meeting of a particular individual, Neem Curly Baba. Not very impressive individual, but they'll try this one. The bioelectrical field that he entered into opened up pathways and had to experience that, like, wait, I want to know more of that. You get that?
Mm.
I want to know that. When somebody comes to me, it's like, because we can put the neuroscience, but I have to put the compassion, I have to put the somatic. One of the questions you asked me, what is somatic? Well, just think of somatic as anything non-intellectual. Basically, anything non-intellectual that you're experiencing your world through these senses. It's a filter. It figures out what's real and not real. And if you're dissociated, which happens to most of us, you're going to see the world in a very confusing place. And it's easy to get stuck into something that attracts you, that's pleasurable, you know, power, money, sex, video distraction, etc., because you get a temporary fix of maybe dopamine or whatever chemical we say, but not that, like, wait a minute, this entire world exists. When the MDMA receptor, because people know, oh yes, I took MDMA, and oh my God, all my senses are heightened. Well, guess what? That is the normal, natural evolutionary pathway. Once your senses are heightened in all areas, you don't go seeking in the same way. You don't go striving in the same way. You are content and happy, and you see beauty in the most simplest things. You see the difference there? Otherwise, the program, back to the ACE study, and it's a fascinating whole story of serendipity. Or if I even told you that story, it's so bizarre, even how it was discovered, because it's all by accident. It was all one of those magical things. What they said was that most chronic illnesses, whether it's heart disease, whether it's cancer, whether it's diabetes. So back to the adverse childhood experience, the ACE study. And it's a fascinating whole story of serendipity. Or if I even told you that story, it's so bizarre, even how it was discovered, because it's all by accident. It was all one of those magical things.
How did it come about?
Okay, here we go. I'll give you the story. So I can't think of his name in a minute, but a particular doctor, right? He worked for Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is the largest HMO in California. So all the school, all these people, they had come to him. He was the head of the preventive medicine section. Are you looking it up?
Is it Dr. Vincent Filetti?
That's it. Dr. Filetti. That's right. So he is asked by the company to do preventive medicine. It's California, right? So he figures I'm going to work on weight. We know obesity is a major contributor to all kinds of disease. All right. So I'm going to do this. He starts that, tries, and he's fairly successful in certain cases. And then there's the magical incident that gives the wake up call. One day, a woman comes in, and he meant to ask her a certain question, but he twisted it around in his head, right? He wanted to ask her, how old were you when you're sexually active, thinking about hormones, etc. But the question gets twisted, and he asked her, how much did you weigh, right? Anyway, it caused a trigger, and she burst out like 60 pounds. And that's when my father first started molesting me, right? So she breaks down, triggers the traumatic event. He's taken back because he says, I've only seen maybe one other case of incest before. This is the difference between a real scientist and one that will just shove stuff down. He says, I started to ask all the clinicians to ask if there was any correlation between a traumatic event, especially in early childhood, and their weight. And it was across the board. I mean, there was we don't even think about it. If you see anybody with heavy level of obesity, unless it's some major glandular thing, right? Or, a tumor on their thyroid or something like this, it's pretty wild that something happened that distorted body image, and there was a form of sort of insulation. Anyway, he is excited. He's got a paper. It's like, wow, I've discovered this amazing thing. A major correlation between early childhood trauma and obesity, right? It's not because they don't know what to eat, And he would say a lot of times these people would lose the weight, and it would take them months and months, and then, oh my God, like within them, they drop out of the program, and in a month, all the weight would be back. That was another mystery, but it can all be explained today because already, because they're not dealing with the real problem. They're not dealing with what's called the etiology of the event. And it's not the event, remember? It's the feelings, it's the viral level, it's the emotion of the event that you're not trained for. Not trained, but once you are trained and you get the right support, it's not like you won't remember the event. The event has no impact. Better than that, even better than not even remembering. Do you understand what I'm saying? So anyway, he goes to a meeting. He goes to a meeting in Atlanta. He wants to talk to his peers. And he says, when he got up and presented, they were so angry and upset. He said if they had stones or tomatoes, they would have thrown them at him. They were like, don't you know that obese people are lazy and they'll tell you anything, that kind of approach, right? So he sits down very dejected at lunch. It's like at school when you're sitting by yourself, and a guy comes over, could I sit with you? And he's like, what do you want? And the guy says, they might not believe a few hundred people in a study, but they have to believe if it's thousands. And I'm from the Center for Disease Control. I have the bucks you need for research. Let's go at it. And then that research would forever change science and the belief systems we have. And it's said again, this is the mythos of the story. When the data started coming down the line to the people collecting the data, it was such an emotional charge. Like you said, you had goosebumps when there's a level of truth.
Yeah.
They were weeping, like realizing, oh my God, humans are not who we think we are. And we've been told by the best of us, right? Whether great master teachers, Yeshua or Jesus or Buddha, that, dude, it's more about how you treat other people. And if you want to learn your stuff, you've got to master this stuff. You got to go in. And it's not just like, don't think, check out, dude. There is a lot of interesting work to be done. And when you're talking about rewiring, and today, from all the neurology, we know that if you want to change the brain, if you have an injured brain, if you have brain damage, you don't cut into the brain, you don't rewire things, you do it all from external. That was a big thing, right? So direction went, but when it came back, it's like, what? How could this be? You hear what I'm saying? It was a different dimension. That knowledge is that you cannot go at it in the same way. No matter if you had an adverse childhood experience or not, that system is highly programmed to interpret matter and reality in a certain way. Get it? If you change that, wide variables. You don't have to come to me because you're resolving trauma or you have chronic pain or you have terrible anxiety, depression. You want to come to because you want to be able to get a chance to see, like, wow. And I'm always looking for people to open up to see what they would come up with. Unfortunately, mainstream medicine isn't necessarily ready to handle it. But they said every doctor in America should give their patient an ACE score. Now, doesn't mean they can do anything about it, but at least they'll start looking. And so if somebody comes in with that chronic condition or that migraine or these neurological symptoms, like I had a guy come to me and he's in his early 30s and he has, like they said, Parkinson symptoms, but they can't find any diagnostic criteria. So I've seen that. We call them functional neurological disorders. Functional, meaning there's no organic lesion, but they'll have seizures, they'll have all the symptoms. Again, back to original journey. It's like, wait a minute. So an energetic event could change you, especially for better or worse. What are your tools? What are your tools?
So I love that you focus on the what are the tools, because the thing that I'm hearing from all of this is we all listen to someone or many people that tell us what our world is going to be like, how it can be, and how it can't be. And we often accept that as truth. That informs what our life can be. But what you're talking about is that our body has an innate wisdom and an ability to respond to the world around us. And if we listen deeply and get intuitively in touch with what our body is communicating, that tells us the truth of A, what we've experienced, but B, how to integrate it and to be in our optimal state.
Yeah. And we don't even know if it's the body. I mean, more it's the brain's communication with the body, but we don't even know. It's so new, right? But it's so exciting, the possibilities that could come out of it. The physical effects that it gave me, the physical changes in the body, the strength, but mostly the ability to experience the world in a heightened state without the use of some kind of drugs or substance, because the classic, even we'll say in the ecstasy experience, right? So that particular pathway, right? So MDMA, right? The traditional response after that is, after they've had a heightened experience, oh my God, this is amazing. I felt this, I felt that, is depression, is a down. Because why? You haven't earned it. It's just telling you you want something like that. That should be the normal. A lot of times we do recommend people work with people that I know, either I've helped train or they have an experience in administering some of these substances, preferably even in lower doses, some type of psychedelic, right? Here's the thing though. After they have the experience, I want them to get into the office within 2 or 3 days. Because if the pathway's open, this is the thing with brain. If the pathway's open and you re-stimulate the pathway, you can have the same experience or something close to it without the substance. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. That's a huge deal. And that's how we're beginning to see how we work. It's like you want to reinforce that pathway. You want information that is usable information. A lot of people do these things, and it's almost like there is psychological addiction happening. Absolutely. I'm going to do bufo. I'm going to do ayahuasca. I'm going to do combo. I'm going to do this. Psychological addiction. If you're doing these things correctly, you should be able to get your information and not have to return for some time. And there should be information that you can apply as usable in your life. Like when I tell people, you are missing the most important parts. Do you have some kind of chronic condition? Well, what would that have anything to do with? Do you have irritable bowel? Yeah. So you haven't been able to use the mushrooms and the psychedelic experience to help you integrate your brain with your gut brain, right? That's where the real vagal system, all this stuff you hear, vagal, vagal, vagal. Well, I was talking autonomic 30 years ago, 35, which is the part of the system. But thanks to an internist named Robert Gershon, and he discovered the enteric or gut brain. And dude, that most of its stimulation is vagal. So don't tell me you're going to use food or do breathing work to stimulate vagal tone. The best possible thing you can do is understand how to place sensory stimulation to the enteric brain, create a feedback loop between your brain and this brain, and you got something you can take to the bank.
So let's talk about that some more too, right? The enteric brain, and even going all the way back to Hindu tradition, right? In the Upanishads, they speak of the three brains: the brain in the head, the stomach or gut, and then the heart. Of course, we'll get into the heart after. But you're speaking about the gut, which we have now found there are smell receptors in the gut, there are memory cells in the gut. There's a lot more going on than we have earlier given credit for. And that this also connects to intuition and how we process experience and emotions, which is very vital in this regard.
Yeah, so you want a usable, reproducible methodology. And so back in the 60s, there was this movement, and the famous movie back then is Biofeedback, the Yoga of the West. And there was this man and his daughter, and they went to India and they studied a lot of these gurus, right? And they hooked them up to basic equipment. They could slow their heartbeat, or they could live with oxygen for a certain amount. But they were first noticing that, again, other humans supposedly had developed self-regulatory mechanisms that others didn't, and they tried to study. And they were trying then to create equipment that would somehow monitor what's happening in here and then give you a input into here. So by using your brain in a certain way, you could change things. It's evolved into a thing called even neurofeedback, if you ever heard of that. So neurofeedback is they'll hold a monitor and they'll say, uh, you're using this part of your brain and you probably should be using some of this. And so how are we going to do that? So they'll either hook up a video game or something that gives you some kind of feedback. But as long as you're dependent again on things like that, you're still dependent. It's okay. But what if this whole thing is designed constantly for information and feedback? When persons use substances like psilocybin, it tends to shut down the distraction parts, the part that allows you to go away. And always the best parts of it is a person's noticing thing and picking up information here. It kind of gets past your firewall, which is saying, no, 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 I'm not letting anything in. And you can kind of get in there. Only thing is that people, just like in everyday life, the problem is that most people distract or dissociate when they feel something of importance. It could be a wonderful signal, but because it's fearful, scary, frightening, even depression, like you said, the model has got to change. Dude, depression is not what we think, right? Depression is often an expression of something back then that you have not dealt with or healed with. And if you do, it pushes your entire evolutionary growth as a human being. You will also self-destruct. Nature is nature. If you don't move with her, if you don't feel her, if you don't know where she's pointing you, you're going to be in trouble, big trouble. But you're not aware of these things if you're stuck in the head, right? If you're just using intellectuals, great. If I want to build a better computer, I want to do you got to use the merging of two, but it's so distorted that we're in a crisis and we don't even realize it. You know, suicide rates, despair, hopelessness climbing, and people don't talk to each other. You know, when I was in Colorado last year, I think it was my wife or my father-in-law brought me a paper because they know I'm interested in that, and it was their local paper in Steamboat Springs. And on the cover, it said suicide belt. Like, we have a suicide belt. Like, we have what? We have more suicide in our area than this town or that town. And so, what's going on? And the lead story was about this guy called Mark who had taken his life and Gretchen. And they said they were considered to be inseparable. They were like soulmates. In fact, if you had a party, you would never think about inviting Gretchen without Mark, right? But the story goes that one day Mark came home. Gretchen was looking for him, couldn't find him. She went back of their house, right? And there he was. He had killed himself. So despair, hopelessness, shame. Why wouldn't he talk to me? Why didn't he feel safe to talk to me? How in our interpersonal relationships we don't feel safe with one another. We don't talk about it. And that, I guarantee you, that thing didn't happen overnight. It just starts to build. And you can't, to everybody out there, don't put stuff off. There is a time and a place. And for many of you, entering into medicine is not always the best thing because we have a lot of people traumatized because all of a sudden it brings up all hell. And it opened up procedural implicit memory. But that can happen with a lot of things. I've seen it happen in yoga and Kundalini because it's not what was done, but it stimulates the pathway. And then there's remembrance, like the Old Spice. Remember the Old Spice generated and she didn't, well, right?
What I experience from this is the one word that comes up is access. It makes these different experiences, whether it's with plant medicine or an extreme experience, it makes certain areas of the body and of the experience accessible that might be blocked off. And so once they become accessible, the question becomes, are we equipped to relate to that in a way that can integrate what that experience is that's stuck or
Right.
blocked? And so what I love about when you speak about plant medicine, because we've had conversations around this, the takeaway I get is not that plant medicine is bad, not that it's good. It can be a very helpful tool, but it needs to have intention behind it. So if I'm working with plant medicine, I need to be clear of what that intention is, but also I need to have tools to be able to respond what the plant
Right.
medicine is bringing up. And if
And
I'm
that
not,
comes from really trained professionals. And because it's a new area, most people don't even know how to work with it. You wouldn't even think, say you had a major physical injury, you couldn't walk, say you're an athlete, would you think that you would use a low dosage? Like, low dosage often is very good, little like a micro or a little bit more, and then use physical therapy or movement therapy at the same time? Totally different world. But you just trusting you by yourself is like hit or miss. Some people get successful, they learn, just like meditation. It's like, you know, it's a lot of work to figure out where to go in there and get it right, you know, but it can be transformative. As a kid, it was so bizarre, but in a wonderfully bizarre, I was a teenager, started, I think, around 17. I spent hours and hours and hours in meditation. Nobody was guiding me, nobody was teaching me, but I was driven. And one day, one amazing day, it paid off. It paid off huge because the feeling I got, the elation, the joy, the lightness of being was beyond anything I could ever imagine, right? And once I knew that was there, it would forever change my life. Problem is, no other friends, nobody to talk with, and eventually you start to lose the skill because, you know, nobody else is doing this. How did I earn the right to that place? You know, and then I'd have to work really hard to try to get it back again. When I started entering into this other world, so here's the other world. Years ago, there was an individual called Donald Epstein who invented network spinal analysis. These are key individuals: Donald Epstein, John Upledger from the Craniosacral Institute, and John Barnes from John Barnes Myofascial out in Sedona. They start doing sensory contacts, somatic contacts that are different than anything we had experienced before. Usually they're very light. Seemingly they would not have much effect because in manual therapy, deep, hard, there was people called like Ida Roth, which did a very deep
Rolfing, right? Yeah.
Rolfing.
And myofascia goes into that vein. It's very physically manipulative.
And that was the first time that people had memory and emotional. So people make up stories. Well, it's the muscle, it's the tissue, it's this, it's that. Nobody knew. They just know that these experiences were happening and they weren't always predictable. But then with these other things, especially with Epstein, it was such a wild thing. I saw him do this thing and I was like, this can't possibly work. But I saw with my own eyes that people, well, here's the thing. I went to a seminar and I went to the seminar because there was a doctor there, an old doctor that had already retired. And he said, he stood up. This is what got me to go to this seminar. He says, I'm retired. I've been a doctor for 50 years or something, And my wife had intractable neck pain. She had multiple discs and nobody can help her. And this doctor helped with her. Well, that wasn't so amazing to me. I've seen that done before. I knew how to do that, right? But this is what he said to me that moved me. He says, what I saw moved me so much, I'm going back into practice. What did you see? So I go that day, and this guy's talking about this. He's talking about healing. He's talking about this. We didn't really know about trauma, but he's talking about healing is an inside job. And then once you're in it, there's a whole bunch of information that downloads from higher consciousness place that starts to move you in a different direction. And you have awareness about what is causing the problem in the first place. Okay, so the seminar's on. That night I go home, but the next day I come back and there was two guys there. One of them guy was this guy named Richard, and he was a kind of doctor that was all about the money, and he worked in PI. Those are with lawyers, and you'd get money from cases, and he was very irritable, not a nice guy, really. And the other guy was this other chiropractor that I just started to befriend. Anyway, I come back the next day, and this Richard guy is a different personality. I mean, it's not the same guy. Richard, what happened? So he proceeds to tell me the story. Remember, I did not witness this myself. He said, I had this thing happen to me. I was a baby. I was in a plane crash that left Kennedy, emergency crash on Rikers Island. My parents were in there. I was a baby. The plane was on fire. My dad kicked out the window, threw me in the snow. All right. But this is what happened. So while they were doing the work, his body started to move. He started to move in ways that he had never witnessed before. He had memories, but remember, procedural memories, feelings of fear, terror, dying, etc., like that. And there was even this bizarre story. That's the catch that people said to me. They saw smoke coming out of his mouth, right? Well, there's a little catch, the little magical catch, whether it's true or not, who knows? All I knew was that this guy was a different guy. And he said, I'm telling all those lawyers that I'm not doing this anymore. I'm quitting my practice. I'm starting a new life right now. Don't recommend that. Didn't go so well in the beginning because you don't want to make radical jumps and shifts. And I remember guiding him after Richard, slow down. Yes, you want to head in this direction. And the other guy was Dr. Andrew Grant. And this got me because this is this big guy and his body was generating all these involuntary movements and waves. And I was like, what the? Didn't happen with a single other person there. Didn't happen with me. So I'm like, I started practicing, trying, didn't work, touching, doing that. Nothing's happening. This is not working. I call up Andy Grant. And I say, Andy, I wanted him to say to me, this stuff's not working. This internal stuff, no, no, no. And he says to me, yes, I am seeing things. And I realized, here's the catch. I got to get work done myself. Duh, right? And we got to experiment with each other to see if there's anything to this sensory input, right? Started to happen, started to change. I couldn't tell anything in the beginning. I remember when I would leave him, I'd run to the bathroom in a restaurant and look in the mirror because I knew I could see changes in my face and my eyes. I could see a lightness of being. When people come out of that room, that's one of the first thing the receptionists look at. They're like, oh my God, your whole face has changed. You're younger, you're more vital. Eventually, something weird happened. And one day I was touching a person, a guy who had been my patient for years, and all of a sudden it opened up the door, the extra door. And he started telling me all kinds of things. He was in a trance, he doesn't even remember it. And he's telling me about electrical magnetic frequency. At that time, people didn't know that like fluorescent lights were bad. He's telling me this, he's telling me that. And then he goes, boop, and he goes back down and he doesn't remember. Another guy started moving and grabbing and talking about when he was choked with a cord around his neck. I mean, it was wild, and people crying and releasing. And I was like, what door was this open? And remember, the contacts are like that. So, needless to say, and I was very well known in the field, like I said, as me. I was like in all the magazines, I was the guy, right? I was the doctor, right? I was the guy that sports medicine. I was the guy that created all the new stuff. Needless to say, a lot of patients said, dude, this is way too weird. I can't stay with you, Dr. Paul. I don't want to see that. And I didn't know what it all was, but I knew I couldn't stop. Remember, that's decades. And then I started to learn the greatest teachers are going to be your patients or who you're working with, because as they enter those states, they're going to give you information that they didn't know and you didn't know. And then you're able to start putting it all together. People were so afraid. Now, on any given day, somebody comes to me and they want to know. It used to be only women. Women would want to know. They knew something had happened, right? And the incidence of traumatic experience or post-traumatic stress proportionally is higher. Now it's like finally men are investigating, and on any given day when I give a questionnaire, I'd say, have you had any experience with plant medicine? A huge amount of people have, right? What did you get? What was there favorable? Was there not favorable? Where are you? Where are you stuck? And the other thing, like what you just said, if we learn how to use this with other particular modalities and therapies, we can open up these pathways. And then eventually, once they're reinforced, so when in the brain, it's called LTP, long term potentiation. So you have to fire that pathway, then she wires. In the same way, you want to get rid of a negative. You know how you get rid of a negative? You have to pull it apart. You know how it pulls apart? In deep, restful, profound sleep, deep vagal tone, deep sleep. And then it says, dude, this is not relevant anymore. I'm not going to haunt you in your dreams. I'm not going to create TMJ. I'm not going to create breathing. I'm going to pull it apart, and you get a do-over, literally get a do-over. And then there's many therapies that can entrain a person's nervous system. You don't have to have a whole trauma thing. But once you work with people that know how to train your nervous system, the vagal, the parasympathetic goes. And so more of. So it isn't like parasympathetic is better than sympathetic. Dude, you need all of them, right? But it's your zone of fitness or emotional fitness or tolerance. And so if you get enough, if you get pissed off, you get angry, you get upset, you come back down.
And that's what the body's designed for, right? Homeostasis is the
That's
optimal
right.
state. It doesn't mean that it wants to be there all the time. You wouldn't be living,
Hell no.
right? But
No.
an animal in nature can go into a heightened state of either attack or fear and return back to homeostasis really quickly. And so this notion that we are experiencing so many blockages and oftentimes living in this heightened state of the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight. This also goes into trauma too, because we could think in terms of extremes often, right? And when we say trauma, a lot of times people's initial response is, "Oh, I haven't had trauma." There's the big T trauma and little t trauma. Big T, which is a large mass event that happens. This could be the pandemic was a big T event, the earthquakes that just took place in Turkey, a terrorist attack like 9/11, big T trauma events. Then there's these little t trauma events, which are much more on the individual level and also can be quite perceptual. Back again to trauma isn't the event that happened, but how we perceived it. And so that's where I believe your work is so powerful, because we all have blockages. And at the end of the day, when we can let that energy flow, we can be in our optimal state and do what we're here to do. as a spirit in this human form. At least that's my belief of it.
Yeah, it sounds good. And it's interesting. The stress, just like exercise is stress, but it's a good stress, or you can be that one of these people that go every day and break yourself down, right? Not good. You can be like, we've seen that guy, like God love him, but like David Goggins, ignoring the body, ignoring pain, being able to run incredible distances and achieve incredible, and he gets accolade. There's energy exchange, and he makes himself feel good about it, but deep down it's very, very destructive. And now, where he could escape, or anyone could escape by being active or doing whatever they do, you can't do it anymore. And now you're going to have to face yourself, and now's the time to go in. And it'd be great even to work with somebody like that, to say, like, because there would be a new message to the world. How is the balance? Is it necessary to do movement? Yes. Is it necessary to do exercise and movement? But connected movement is totally different than non-connected. And even Harvard University, they created a whole center. It's called the Center for the Developing Child. And we use some of their slides because they say the future of future generations is dependent on the ability of us, of the organism, to manage these stressful responses. And they give a model. It's a brilliant model. And they believe that most of that method is passed down through the mother, right? So the mother's ability to downregulate her autonomics, right, under a stressful event. You can take a model, little circle, and you have the mother in there and the child's in there, and everybody's feeling peaceful. The child enters out into challenge and stress. This is what life's about. And this time, maybe the child encounters the cat, and this time the cat scratches the child. The child screams and cries. Mom's reaction is the most important thing next. Does she freak out? Does she raise an arousal stage? Does she scream at the kid? I told you, does she scream at the cat? Or does she bring him into her bioelectrical field and just, and that creates that space of vagal and parasympathetic. You get it?
Yeah, and this goes into Siegel's work. We've been fed this misnomer that we self-regulate, and especially in our macho paradigm where it's like, all right, just, toughen it up and just push through it. This idea that like you are able to just convince yourself to just keep going and to regulate your own body. The reality is that we're designed for co-regulation, at first with our mother, then with our nucleus environment, then with our larger community or tribe. And we've in a lot of ways lost touch with that. This comes to a place of being vulnerable and open to it, but allowing ourselves to also have time when we're feeling something to feel those feelings in the presence of someone that creates comfort for us. It's not that they even need to do anything.
Thank you. Or support. That's it. Exactly. Exactly right. Exactly. But sometimes, like you said, these episodes, or another term is called allostatic load. So allostatic load is accumulation of stressor over a lifetime. That's why sometimes it doesn't even seem like a lot happened, and then you've lost it. And most of these things you see is repetitive, especially what we went through, repetitive stressors without release and renewal. And so we're getting really stuck. And we are pushing ourselves into an unnatural environment. What happens is, the big catch is, if that stress gets too high, and especially early, your ability to get pleasure or joy out of human interaction is off. And so one of the key things is we have to put people through a series of neurological tests to see how well they can feel and sense. And you'd be surprised how many these tests, like they're not connected. If you're not connected, you can't get the good feeling. You get it? So once they're in and you get it, then it's a different world. Then they get a chance to see. And then these high level vibrations, forgiveness, not necessary of other people, but yourself is the big thing. Self-love, reducing shame, guilt. Brene Brown, all those people have they've got pieces of it. Yeah, guilt and shame is a major one there.
And coming back to that third brain, the heart, there's amazing studies that look at the biophotons that are emitted from a heart on any given day, the average amount are 20 biophotons per second emitted by the heart. Well, if somebody goes and they do a meditation for just 10 minutes and they focus on gratitude and compassion, sending love to others, that increases not just twofold, not just tenfold, but from 20 to 100,000 biophotons per
Well,
second.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. But still, you want a direct experience. So if I'm a therapist and I have a couple and they're just hating each other, there's no connection, but I give them MDMA and I start my therapy and they bust through that and they're touching each other and they're feeling love for the first time and they get a sense of that that's real, you got a door in. You get it? And then the therapist may say, hey, I'm going to give you a low dosage of psilocybin too, and we're going to keep going. And all of a sudden they're able to talk and they're like able to express, but you have to feel it to heal it. So there's a real possibility when you give that, they're like, oh my God, I love you. I really love you. But all this anger and all this hate and all this thing has stopped me. So even though, like I said, there's all these nice, wonderful stories, and God love them, the heart math of people and all that, but it has to be reproducible and practical. Because in science and medicine, if you can't reproduce it, it does have no value. There's plenty of people that have like, wow, I had a spontaneous feeling or I had spontaneous remission. But dude, if you can't give that out, and that's where I'm coming, I'm saying, hey, put me in the group, put me with your group. I can give you pieces that could be very useful to you. Like you see, one of the major causes of crises for a policeman, a soldier, and a fireman is the same thing. It's anxiety, depression, and suicide. That's the number one cause of death. I kind of stayed on the sidelines for a long, long time because I was like, I would do seminars and I was like, I would test people to see how much they could grasp. I remember one time it was a big honor for me because I went to a major military base in Colorado called Fort Carson's, and we had a connection, so we got on. But when I got there, then the commander made an announcement, and he said all the mental health people should come to listen to this. Right? Again, he got in, made me bigger than I was. Didn't matter. So these people showed up, top, therapists and everything. And they loved what I was saying. But get this, when I went to or had my other therapist help me to open them up, because when we open you up, you're going to feel things, you're going to see things, you're going to have emotional, you're going to have physical things. They didn't want to go there. Like I haven't, like one of them called me, I can't have emotion. I can't cry. I have to put things together. I can't go through this place of re-regulation. I can't go through a homeostatic reflex. I'm like, dude, it ain't going to happen. I need people that know the work. I need people that can carry. Like Gabor has this thing he calls it now that he's trying to add. He said compassionate inquiry, right? Not just
Mm.
inquiry, not just traditional psychotherapy, but how do you give somebody compassion? Compassion is something you have to earn. And if you know Gabor's study, it's like, dude, I remember when I was at that seminar too for the veterans, and I went up to him because I knew he had had experiences with ayahuasca. But watch this. So I went up to him and said, Gabor, like, hey, like, I know you've been dabbling with this and what's your experience? He went, didn't say a word. I'm like, something was wrong. Like he was upset. Turned out that if you know his story, he had this experience with ayahuasca. And he said it's the first time he felt a love, felt real love. Never came from parents, right? Because there's Holocaust survivors. It's that whole thing is intergenerational. They can't give something they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what I tell people: love doesn't belong to people. It doesn't belong to a person. They just borrow it. It's a frequency. It's a vibration. And once you experience it, especially outside, that's also where the God thing comes in, the spirit thing is in, because like, oh my God, this has to be God. You call it whatever you want, right? But it's so divine, it can change course, right? And so he was like, change course. So then he says, oh, I'm going to try to set this up for other people. So he got his family involved. Problem is the authorities, the governing board, the medical board wasn't so happy with it, and they shut that down. They took his license. And that was around that time. That's why he didn't want to talk to me at that time.
Mm-hmm.
You get that?
Yeah.
Now it made him a star because Gabor was around for a long time. He wrote some brilliant books, but he wasn't as popular. A guy, Robert Scare, was really popular. the body bears the burden. You probably don't even hear about him. I don't know what happened to Robert. He was brilliant. And Robert was one of the first to bring into his office a physical therapist. So he was moving the two. He wasn't just talking about trauma. He was trying to activate the mechanical part. Peter Levine, don't ever leave him out. He was very important because he saw what I saw. Spontaneous movement started to happen in people's offices. That's how when he wrote the book, The Waking the Tiger. He was in his office one day talking, all of a sudden, the body starts shaking and she's moving and she's getting hot and cold, all autonomics and pupils and all these things going through regulation. And then some wisdom. The person all of a sudden taps into a wisdom that they didn't know about their life. And there's a resolution. It's like, it got him going. And I remember I used to sell more Waking the Tigers than anybody I know because I was trying to get other psychotherapists. I tried to get anybody involved in this path. And there was nobody. I went to Barry University. I got them. I spoke to trauma there. I got Bezel to come there. I finally started to get them to like, dude, those are licensed clinical social workers. Like, you're missing this point here. But the most important things, if you don't know it from the inside, you're never going to know it. So every therapist I've ever trained, everybody I ever looked for, I look for somebody that's brave enough to go on that journey. And a lot of people, they can only go so far. That you even asked me to do this thing, the reason I'm doing it too is like, I'm hoping somebody out there hears me more, or, they're already trying to help other people. Yes, people may want to get help personally. I'm always open, but I'm always looking for individuals, even like yourself, that have an awareness of the bigger picture and want to spread it. And that's because we live today in this thing where we can reach people. And there's got to be some superstars out there that if I can just give them a piece, or they can give me a piece.
And hopefully have them experience it themselves.
There you go. That's it.
It's all in the experience. And I'd love to share some of mine because I think it might illuminate a little as well. First off, what I take from a lot of your work is stepping away from the story that so many of us carry. When we've had a trauma, consciously or unconsciously, we generate a story that becomes a pattern and a loop. And then we see these occurrences keep on happening in our lives. Different people come about, but they play the same role. And it puts us in the same situation. And it keeps on unfolding. And it tends to get bigger and louder over time. And people either retreat and they give in to the failure of it because it becomes too much, or they play avoidance or numbing or any of these other tactics. But what you do is invite the individual to step out of the story. I think this is one of the other benefits of working with plant medicine. You can momentarily let go of the story and see something else. The key is you need to be able to keep what you see when you come back down into the real world and be able to work with that. And that's where I believe your work is so powerful, because you might use a little story as a gateway to get into the body, but then it's completely intuitive around the feeling of the body, the experience of the body, and where something is stuck. And when you talk about these involuntary movements, there are some videos that go around online that show stuff that's really extreme. And I would say, from my experience, that's not what you're doing. You're not doing manipulation of the body. You're stimulating parts of the body where there might be a blockage that then facilitates an unfolding or a release, or even better, an integration.
And just to say, because there's a lot of, you'll see these people waving their hands over and people moving and stuff like that, right? Very easy to disprove it. Have their eyes closed, take that person away, have another person that doesn't know anything about do the exact same thing will happen. Have a monkey do it, same thing. They're self-generate. You got to be so careful with people. Bezel always would say this too. Bezel would say, people would say, I have a new trauma technique. And he'd say, okay, send me a video. And he'd look at the video and he'd go, oh my God, because what happens if you don't know boundaries in a body, you're going to get in trouble. So we all have different boundaries. I may be able to touch here on somebody else. I may not be able to touch there. Point being, I had a patient and he came to me years ago, and he came to me and he told me this story. He said, I got to tell you my story. I had a really great job, was working at the Breakers. Everything was going well for me. One day I was in a movie theater, and it was a particularly violent movie. That wasn't the worst for me, but the worst was as I looked over, there was a man with a small child who clearly should have not been in here, right? The rating would not permit, should have never been in. And the child was really distressed, having a hard time. He couldn't watch the movie. He couldn't watch the movie. He was getting angry. Do I go over? Do I rescue the child? Do I tell this guy off? Anyway, that night, it opened the door, implicit and procedural. And that meant he had terrible anxiety. He started to have all kinds of body pains. He couldn't breathe. And then memories started to come up, which he had blocked, which was of his uncle who had sexually molested him. Not knowing what to do, he asked around and he found a therapist, an older gentleman therapist, and he was able to give him some help. As Bezel would call it, top down instead of bottom up. Top down means use cognition, reason, or logic to try to harness unwanted emotions and feelings. Bottom up is the new world, the somatic world, the trauma world, where we're taking bits and pieces of fragmented energy and experiences and integrating it into whole. You see, it's a different world.
I'd also even look at it in some ways as external versus internal.
That's
And
right.
one of the things I find so powerful about your work, first, you set that space and you hold it, which I think allows for that co regulation to exist. It's facilitated. Then the other part is that you're not playing the role of the healer here to fix someone. You're holding space and empowering someone, giving them the tools
Exactly.
to navigate their own inner space. And that's, I believe, the future of healing.
Exactly. And it means that we got to get therapists, doctors, physical, anybody that is willing to go in, because then there's a whole body of information and that connection, because human beings need that sacred connection. And that's where they feel seen, like you said, listened to without me. I mean, I'm blabbing away, not talking and just listening a lot of times to the person and creating that sacred environment. But listening to the body is another thing. Watching for cues, watching for affect. Back to this guy, there's an important aspect about the story. So he comes to me and I says, well, what happened? He said the older man died and the trauma's back because he never really resolved it. Remember, it's very biological. You've got to move and dissolve it. So I didn't watch my boundary. So back to what I was saying. So I did this. It seems normal, like you just touch a person's head to calm them, right? We have receptors. The great stress researcher in the whole world is Sapolsky, right, with the baboons. And he found, boy, they got receptors all over. And especially when they groom themselves like that, it turns off the HP axis, the cortisol distress response. Hello? That's why, oh my God, you ever get a good massage when you're getting your hair washed or touch or light touch, it can reset the whole damn stress thing. Anyway, but I didn't watch my boundary, right? I usually, is this okay? Do some permission. Tell me if something comes up. It's got to be safe. Even how I use my voice. Even a lot of people are not safe with the man. It's not safe with the women. We have to figure all these things to get past the firewall. So I didn't ask. And guess what happens? He jumps off the table and he's cursing with all these expletives, saying like, and I was like, oh God, I'm so sorry. No one touches me, he's screaming. No one F touches me, right? So is that from me or is that the memory? Needless to say, it would screw up his relationships, intimate relationships, up to his entire life up to that point. It's never going to go past a certain point. So I said, no, sorry. But I made him a promise. I said, in every other therapy on the planet, they would avoid touching you or connecting to that. I said, we're going to train for the marathon one day. I know you can't do the marathon. I know you can't do a triathlete right now, but I'm going to train you. And one day, with your permission, it's called a startle reflex. It's a therapeutic reflex. Normally, when you startle, the more stress, it's a neurological test. The more stress, the more you startle, right? I'm like, dude, when you're ready, and we got there. I said, here we go. And I just went, wee. And he moved, he shook, he laughed, he cried, he saw colors. And in the end, he had a peace he had never known. And I could do that from here to the end of the world and never cause a reaction again. That's knowledge.
Yeah.
That's knowledge. And that has to be shared. But you see, you got it. You can't just give an intellectual linear level. That's what we've been trying to do. When you go to be a therapist, when you go to be a doctor, it's like, dude, no, 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 no. Yes, you got to know certain aspects. It's good to understand the body and the brain. But if you don't go there yourself, you will never be given. That's sacred knowledge. That is the knowledge that the mystics talked about. They're like, dude, you got to experience it. And usually they wait. Like you always hear in mystical Judaism and the Kabbalah is like, dude, we're going to wait till like 20, no, 30, no, 40. 40 is good. You see what I'm saying? Because by then, you got a family, you got kids, you're not chasing women, you're not chasing power. And then maybe you can get to knowledge. But knowledge, you can't study. You can't. You want to know. It's like, it's even the great mystics like Yeshua, Jesus is like, dude, it's not about reading and worship. Don't worship me. He wants you to be like me. You want to fry a Christian's brain? Read the passage where he says, you will do things, others will do things like me and greater than me. That blows their brain. That blows their brain because they're like, how can you do greater than God? How can you do greater than me? No, the endless possibility, right? We want to see good. That's what I'm always looking for. I tell people, I just want to see you do good. They're like, Dr. Paul, how can I pay you back? Go out and do good. Go out and serve. Go out and do something. Go and create. Use the creative force to awaken good in the world.
Absolutely. Dr. Paul, thank you so much. Can you tell us where can folks find you and how could they experience your work?
You can just go on YouTube or you can go on and just look at my name, Dr. Paul Canali, and you'll find me. You can talk to me personally. You call the office. If you want to talk to me personally, they'll give you my cell phone. I'd love to talk to you and help you, guide you. Even if I can't, maybe I can lead you into the direction, like a better direction. Really enjoyable talking to you.
Thanks, Dr. Paul. Thanks for joining us this week on Growth Guide. A big thanks to our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute. You may have listened to the episode I did with founder Morag Gamble. She's incredibly knowledgeable in permaculture practices and communes with nature on the deepest of levels. The conversation we had revealed how returning to a healthy relationship with nature brings us internal peace and harmony. Whether in schools, prisons, on farms, or in our backyards, the result's always the same. Morag devotes her life to restoring our soil and enriching community. Whether you're looking to level up an established career or into community farming or being called to this field for your next chapter, the wealth of knowledge and wisdom Morag offers is paramount. This is where the Permaculture Educators program comes in. It's a global online learning community led by Morag Gamble. The program includes dual certificates of permaculture design and permaculture teaching. If you're called to be a part of the positive change growing around the world through living simpler, speaking up, and teaching permaculture, this course is for you. For anyone looking to make permaculture their way of life and their livelihood too. For more information, visit growthguide.love/perma. This episode is sponsored by Morning Man. Live manly, own the morning. I learned about this from UFC champ Frank Shamrock. He was always having trouble getting started in the morning without like 7 or 8 cups of coffee. No exaggeration, I've seen this in person. So he created this product that's packed full of 45 superfoods and it has 95 milligrams of clean caffeine, so you get that charge from the greens and also get a hit from the caffeine without feeling all jacked up. I'm definitely caffeine sensitive and I like this product because it doesn't make me feel like I'm bouncing off the walls, but I feel sharp and energized to get shit done. Visit growthguide.love/morningman to learn more and use promo code GROWTH for 15% off. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Atmananda Yoga. You guys have got to check out their yoga alignment mat. I've been using this for a long time. As you know by now, I've studied and trained with them as a yoga teacher, and the mat is incredible to deepen your practice and to ensure a lifelong injury-free practice. Visit growthguide.love/alignment for more info or to buy. Be sure to use code GROWTH at checkout for 15% off. Make sure to visit our website, growthguide.love, where you can find freebies, exclusive content, and subscribe to the show so you'll never miss an episode. If If you found value in listening, I'd really appreciate a rating on iTunes. I can't tell you just how important this is. Or spread the love. Tell your friends, your fam, heck, tell your spirit animals. And follow me on Instagram at growthguide.love. Be sure to tune in next week for our newest episode.